In the terrifying, highly uncertain months of late 1942, the vibrant, subtropical city of Brisbane, the sprawling capital of Queensland, Australia, found itself violently transformed into a massive, heavily fortified, and deeply claustrophobic military garrison. With the terrifying, seemingly unstoppable Imperial Japanese forces rapidly advancing southward through New Guinea and aggressively bombing the northern Australian coastline, Brisbane was hastily established as the absolute, vital epicenter of the Allied command in the southwest Pacific area. The city's relatively small, quiet pre-war population of roughly 300,000 civilians was suddenly, overwhelmingly inundated by a massive, unprecedented influx of over 80,000 heavily armed, highly stressed military personnel. While tens of thousands of these soldiers were young, battle-hardened Australians returning from the grueling, horrific desert campaigns of North Africa and the Middle East, the vast majority were fresh, deeply confident, and highly conspicuous American servicemen, including the arrogant, heavily armed military police known as the Snowdrops, named for their gleaming white helmets, gaiters, and batons. This sudden, massive, and highly compressed collision of two distinctly different, profoundly proud military cultures within a single, highly stressed urban environment rapidly created a toxic, incredibly volatile social powder keg. The simmering, deeply entrenched resentment between the Australian diggers and the American Yanks was fundamentally rooted in a profound, incredibly stark, and highly visible inequality. The American soldiers, heavily subsidized by the massive, booming industrial economy of the United States, were paid significantly, exponentially more than their exhausted, battle-weary Australian counterparts. A lowly American private frequently earned a higher daily wage than a seasoned, highly decorated Australian non-commissioned officer. This massive, glaring financial disparity allowed the American troops to effortlessly dominate the local, highly restricted wartime economy. They easily afforded the absolute best cuts of rationed meat, the finest available alcohol, and, most explosively, they monopolized the romantic attention of the local Australian women. The American servicemen, equipped with highly tailored, stylish, and incredibly crisp custom-made uniforms that sharply contrasted with the baggy, uncomfortable, and heavily worn coarse wool of the Australian issue, possessed an undeniable, highly attractive Hollywood glamour. They generously distributed highly coveted, severely rationed luxury items like fine silk stockings, rich American chocolate, and expensive, high-quality cigarettes to the local women, completely and effortlessly outcompeting the impoverished, deeply resentful Australian soldiers on their own home soil. Furthermore, the Australian veterans, men who had miraculously, barely survived the horrific, muddy, and deeply traumatic sieges of Tobruk and El Alamein, viewed the newly arrived Americans with a deep, visceral, and highly aggressive contempt. They perceived the Yanks as incredibly arrogant, dangerously inexperienced, and profoundly boastful chocolate soldiers, men who looked immaculate on the parade ground but had absolutely no real comprehension of the horrific, bloody realities of modern, industrialized combat. This deep, burning professional resentment was violently exacerbated by the deeply unequal, highly segregated, and profoundly racist nature of the American military structure itself. The Australian soldiers, who proudly maintained a fiercely egalitarian, deeply democratic tradition within their own ranks, were profoundly disgusted by the arrogant, heavily armed American military police, who ruthlessly, violently, and aggressively enforced strict, humiliating racial segregation laws among their own black troops directly on the streets of Brisbane, violently beating American soldiers with heavy wooden batons for minor infractions. By late November 1942, the suffocating, humid air of Brisbane was thick with profound, toxic, and deeply aggressive hatred. The massive, overcrowded pubs and narrow, dark city streets were completely saturated with tens of thousands of heavily drinking, deeply resentful, and highly aggressive young men, requiring only a single, minor spark to violently detonate the entire city. The horrific, inevitable, and completely catastrophic explosion of violence finally occurred on the warm, deeply humid, and incredibly tense evening of November 26, 1942. The absolute epicenter of the disaster was the intersection of Albert and Adelaide Streets in the very heart of Brisbane's bustling, overcrowded central business district, directly outside the massive, highly popular American Red Cross Exchange, the PX. The PX was a massive, highly visible, and deeply hated symbol of American wealth and privilege, exclusively offering highly subsidized, luxurious goods, fine meals, and cheap alcohol entirely unavailable to the heavily rationed, deeply impoverished Australian population. At approximately 7 p.m., a heavily intoxicated, highly aggressive American soldier named Private James Stein was loudly, aggressively arguing with three deeply resentful, heavily drinking Australian soldiers on the busy, crowded sidewalk. As the loud, aggressive verbal altercation rapidly escalated toward physical violence, a heavy, dark American military police jeep suddenly, violently screeched to a halt at the intersection. Two massive, heavily armed American MPs, brandishing their heavy, solid wood batons and exuding absolute, uncompromising authority, aggressively jumped out of the vehicle and immediately, violently confronted the three Australian soldiers, explicitly demanding they immediately disperse and forcefully attempting to aggressively arrest the intoxicated American private. However, the deep, boiling, and highly toxic resentment of the Australian troops had finally, irrevocably reached its absolute, catastrophic limit. The three Australian soldiers, completely refusing to be intimidated or violently physically bullied by the deeply hated, arrogant American MPs on their own sovereign streets, aggressively, violently fought back. They physically, violently tackled the heavily armed MPs, viciously punching them in their faces and aggressively attempting to physically disarm them of their heavy wooden batons. Within mere seconds, the isolated, highly localized physical brawl violently erupted into a massive, uncontrolled, and absolutely terrifying full-scale urban riot. Hundreds of deeply angry, heavily intoxicated Australian soldiers, sailors, and even civilian bystanders who had been drinking in the nearby, crowded pubs rapidly, aggressively flooded out into the dark, narrow street, violently surging toward the highly visible, deeply hated American MPs. The two desperately outnumbered American policemen, completely terrified and severely bleeding, drew their heavy, loaded .45 caliber service revolvers and frantically, desperately retreated backward toward the highly fortified entrance of the massive American PX building. The massive, roaring, and completely uncontrollable Australian mob, screaming fierce, violent obscenities and hurling heavy, jagged glass beer bottles, heavy cobblestones, and large pieces of broken wood, violently charged the retreating MPs. In a moment of absolute, terrifying panic and complete, disastrous tactical failure, one of the retreating American military policemen, Private Norbert Grant, desperately raised his heavy, loaded shotgun and fired directly, violently, and point-blank into the massive, surging, and heavily armed Australian mob. The deafening, terrifying roar of the heavy shotgun blast violently echoed through the narrow city streets, instantly transforming the chaotic, drunken brawl into a horrific, blood-soaked massacre. The heavy lead buckshot violently, fatally struck a young, incredibly popular Australian soldier named Gunner Edward Webster directly in the chest, instantly, brutally killing him in the middle of the crowded street. Several other Australian soldiers and innocent civilian bystanders were severely, horrifically wounded by the chaotic spray of heavy, lethal lead. The sudden, violent, and absolutely shocking murder of an Australian soldier by an American military policeman entirely, completely shattered any remaining semblance of order or basic human restraint. The massive, deeply enraged Australian mob, now driven by an absolute, uncontrollable, and deeply psychotic bloodlust, completely, violently besieged the massive American PX building. They aggressively, violently smashed the large, heavy glass windows, desperately attempted to violently tear down the heavy wooden doors, and fiercely, ruthlessly hunted down any American soldier unfortunate enough to be caught outside in the dark, chaotic city streets, brutally, severely beating them into unconsciousness in the dirty gutters. The Battle of Brisbane had officially, violently begun. For several terrifying, chaotic, and deeply bloody hours, the central business district of Brisbane was completely, utterly engulfed in a massive, uncontrolled, and highly violent state of absolute urban warfare. Over 3,000 deeply enraged, heavily intoxicated Australian soldiers, violently joined by hundreds of supportive, angry local civilians, completely surrounded and aggressively, violently besieged the heavily fortified American PX building. The deeply terrified American personnel trapped inside, including female Red Cross workers and unarmed servicemen, frantically barricaded the heavy wooden doors with large tables and heavy furniture, listening in absolute, paralyzing terror to the deafening roar of the massive, violent mob and the constant, terrifying shattering of heavy glass. The overwhelmed, highly disorganized local Australian civilian police force, possessing only wooden batons and completely lacking riot gear, completely, absolutely failed to restore any semblance of order. In fact, several local police officers actively, openly sympathized with the deeply angry Australian soldiers and deliberately, quietly refused to intervene in the massive, brutal beatings of American servicemen occurring in the dark, chaotic alleys. To prevent an absolute, catastrophic bloodbath, the senior Australian military commanders urgently, desperately deployed heavily armed, highly disciplined Australian infantry units and armored vehicles to physically, aggressively clear the rioting streets at bayonet point, finally, slowly, and violently forcing the massive, exhausted mob to disperse into the dark, freezing night. However, the deep, burning, and highly toxic hatred did not completely evaporate with the dawn. The very next evening, November 27th, the violent, chaotic rioting violently, aggressively erupted once again across the heavily scarred city. Massive, highly organized, and deeply angry mobs of heavily armed Australian soldiers ruthlessly, systematically roamed the dark, tense streets, actively, aggressively hunting for American military policemen and viciously, brutally assaulting them with heavy wooden clubs, sharp knives, and heavy leather belts. The violence only finally, completely subsided when the senior military command of both Allied nations implemented incredibly strict, highly draconian, and heavily enforced curfews, physically, violently confining the tens of thousands of heavily armed troops to their respective, heavily guarded military camps and deploying massive, heavily armed joint patrols to ruthlessly, aggressively secure the deeply traumatized city center. The final, official casualty toll of the horrific, unprecedented two-day Battle of Brisbane was deeply shocking. One Australian soldier, Gunner Edward Webster, was brutally, tragically dead, and hundreds of men, both Australian and American, were severely, horrifically injured, requiring urgent, extensive medical hospitalization for massive, heavy blunt force trauma, severe stab wounds, and dangerous, traumatic gunshot injuries. In the immediate, highly tense aftermath of the violent, bloody riots, the Supreme Allied Military Command, completely terrified that the massive, deeply embarrassing public knowledge of a violent, massive, and highly deadly armed conflict between the two vital Allied armies would completely, utterly shatter international morale and provide a massive, invaluable propaganda victory to the Imperial Japanese, instituted a massive, and entirely pervasive campaign of absolute, uncompromising censorship. The highly compliant Australian press was strictly, explicitly ordered to completely, utterly suppress any detailed, accurate reporting of the massive, chaotic violence. The horrific, bloody death of Gunner Webster was briefly, vaguely reported as a tragic, minor incident, and the massive, full-scale, and highly destructive urban warfare was entirely, deliberately downplayed as a minor, insignificant scuffle between a few intoxicated soldiers. The American MP who fired the fatal, deadly shotgun blast, Private Norbert Grant, was swiftly, quietly court-martialed by the U.S. military, but he was ultimately, highly controversially acquitted on the strict legal grounds of self-defense, a decision that deeply, permanently infuriated the Australian public. 4 decades, the true, terrifying scale, the profound, deep-seated resentment, and the absolute, violent chaos of the Battle of Brisbane remained a heavily suppressed, deeply embarrassing, and highly uncomfortable secret, a dark, violent stain on the carefully constructed, highly idealized narrative of the unbreakable wartime alliance.